Hi everyone, welcome to another lesson in Introduction to Statistics. This is the first week of the third quarter of the school year, and the first lesson that we're going to discuss in class is the concept of normal distribution. Now, before we proceed with defining what a normal distribution is in comparison to other kinds of distribution, let us clarify first what we are expected to achieve in this lesson. So these are the five objectives that we hope everybody would be able to satisfy or acquire by the end of the topic. First is everyone should be able to relate what we call as density curves and the concept of histograms. So we've already talked about histograms before in the first quarter, and density curves are in a way similar to histograms because they also represent distributions. I'm going to talk about more of that in detail later. But there's something about working with density curves that makes it a much better representation of distributions than histograms. Second is we will also state the different properties of density curves, particularly the normal density curve. So we should also be able to know when do we say that a density curve is considered to be normal. Third is we should be able to identify the effects of the mean and the standard deviation to the normal distribution. Number four, we should be able to state and apply what we call as the empirical rule. And finally, we should find the area under the normal curve by making use of Microsoft Excel. So I'll teach you later one of the formulas that we can use in MS Excel to do the calculations for finding the area under the normal density curve. All right. So let's begin by taking a look first at the concept of histogram, which we are, like I said, we are already familiar with because of the lessons that we had in the first quarter. And you should remember that the idea of a histogram is that it is a representation of the distribution of a variable. It tells us what values of the variable takes and how often it takes these values. So if you can visualize what a histogram is again, we remember that it is a graph with the x and the y axis, wherein we see on the x axis all of the possible values of the random variable, and on the y axis we see the frequency at which each of the values in the of at which each of the values of the variable occurred in our data set. So because the kind of variables that we work with or we represent in histograms are continuous variables, meaning they can take any number within a certain interval, we notice that the values that we see on the x-axis are also continuous. Therefore, there should be no gaps in between the bars that we see in a histogram. So the distribution of quantitative variables is commonly shown using a histogram. It uses continuous vertical lines to represent the frequencies of the classes. So let's take a look at one example to remind us of what exactly we are talking about. Now, the graph that you see on the right is the histogram for runner's miles. So we notice that what we see on the x-axis are the class boundaries of the total distance that is ran by several runners. So for example, what we mean by 5.5 here is 5.5 miles. So on the y-axis, what we see are the number of runners who were able to run a certain distance. So for example, within the interval 5.5 to 10.5 miles, that means that we see one runner who was able to run some distance between these two values. And then we see that there are five who were able to run a total distance between 20.5 to 25.5. So that's how a histogram works. All right. Now, we should also remember that histograms can come in different forms. The more common one is we make use of the frequencies, the actual frequencies of each of the boundaries or the intervals that we set for the values of the variable. This is the same thing that we saw in the previous slide. So we see the frequency represented in the y-axis, but we can also choose to represent or to present the data by making use of what we call as relative frequency. So if you remember, relative frequencies are basically just the percentages for every interval in the histogram. So if we take a look, for example, at the second class interval bounded by 10.5 and 15.5, we notice that this is equivalent to 0.1, which means that 10% of all of the runners whose distances were recorded in this data, 10% of them were able to run a total distance of anywhere between 10.5 to 15.5 miles. So we call this form of histogram with relative frequencies on the y-axis as a relative frequency distribution. All right. Now, you may consider that this is quite a bit similar to the previous topic that we talked about before we ended the second quarter. So supposedly we were supposed to discuss the binomial distribution, but we were not able to find enough time to do that because of the difficulties that we encountered. But if you remember that the last topic that we were able to talk about in this our synchronous session is the concept of um, the probability mass function, or in other words, the probability distribution for discrete random variables. So if you remember that topic quite well, you would be able to imagine that in a probability distribution, very similar to what we see now, in a probability distribution for discrete random variable, we see the individual values of the discrete random variable on the x-axis, and we see the probability that each of those values would occur depending on the conditions in the experiment that we need to do for it, right? So we see also, we notice some similarities with that probability distribution with the relative frequency distribution. So for one, the values that we see on the y-axis are all less than 1. In fact, since the whole um, histogram would be equal to 100%, it represents 100% of the total distribution, then the sum of all of these percentages per interval should also be equal to 100% or 1. And you would remember that one of the important characteristics of a probability distribution for discrete random variables is that the sum of the probabilities is always equal to 1. And we will talk more about it later. So the relative frequencies, again, just to emphasize, they represent probabilities. And we also call it as the densities of each class. Okay, so take note of that. Probabilities and densities, whenever we talk about it in the perspective of histograms, or at least in this lesson, we are pertaining to the same thing. All right. Now, what's so interesting about histograms is that when we try to take a look at its shape, we would be able to notice that we can actually draw a curve to represent the area that is covered by the whole by the set of bars that we look into. Now we can actually create a different histogram, but using the same distribution. So we can represent the same distribution with a different histogram. But in this other histogram, we can create smaller intervals, right? So if you can imagine that if we create smaller intervals, like instead of 5.5 to 10.5, the class size is equal to 5, maybe we can set the width of the bars from 5.5 to 6.5, and then 6.5 to 7.5, and so on and so forth. So what we would see here are actually narrower bars, right? And the narrower the bars become, the more defined the curve is going to be. The curve which represents the top of each of the bars that we see in our histogram. And whenever we do that, what we're actually creating is what we call as the density curve based on the histogram. We can use a smooth curve to approximate the histogram so we can better describe the shape of the distribution. Now, if the y-axis represents the probabilities, these values over here, if they represent the probabilities or densities instead of frequencies of each class, then the curve is what we call as a probability density curve, or simply we call it as a density curve. All right, so density curves actually draw on the idea of histograms. Think of it as a curve that is a representation of the same data that a histogram represents, but more of looking at the whole data as a whole instead of several parts. A density curve is a theoretical curve that describes the distribution of a continuous variable. So take note that at this point, we are not anymore interested, at least for in this lesson, we are putting aside discrete random variables, and we are more interested in looking at continuous random variables. So because these variables are continuous, remember that, like I said, there should be no gaps in between the bars, no matter how narrow the bars are. Therefore, we should see that the curve, the density curve that we create, should have no gaps in it. It should be a whole continuous curve. All right. Here are some important properties of the density curve. Since the probabilities are non-negative, the density curve is always on or above the x-axis. All right. So we remember that it does not make sense for the probability or the density of a certain value of the random variable to have a negative value, because we cannot explain what a negative probability would mean. The least value that we can determine for, or the least value of probability that we can determine for a value of the random variable should be equal to 0. All right. The total area under the density curve is exactly equal to 1. So because 100% of the data should fall within the area that is covered by the density curve, its area, the area covered by the density curve, must also be equal to 1. Here are some advantages of density curves. So density curves give us an idealized picture of the data set. Second, unlike histogram, density curves do not depend on intervals. So like I said, we do not take a look at what is advantageous in representing distributions with histograms, is we're able to make comparisons between intervals. But in density curves, since we are not anymore interested in comparing specific intervals within the data set, and we are more interested in analyzing what exactly the whole distribution is telling us, the density curve becomes more advantageous in making assumptions about the whole distribution. Number 3, generally, it is easier to work with a smooth curve, especially given a huge population. So you may not realize this now, but the greater your population is, the more defined the curve is going to be, especially if the distribution with a large population is normally distributed. And we'll talk about what we mean by normal distribution later as we go along. Now, just like histograms, density curves come in different shapes and forms, but the normal density curve will be the most useful to us. Okay. So now let's take a look at the different shapes of distributions. Because density curves provide a visual representation of a certain distribution, we also call it as the shape of the distribution. And what we're going to do now is I would like you to take a look at the 3 different distributions, the 3 different density curves representing 3 different distributions that you see on the slide. Now, what do you notice? Now, what these three images, what these 3 density curves are telling us is that distributions can vary in terms of symmetry. Like I feel like some of you may were able to easily identify that there are similarities in the density curves, but what makes them different is that only one of them can be considered as symmetric, right? And we have to identify what exactly do we mean by that, and how do we talk about symmetry when we consider density curves. Now, the idea of symmetry in density curves is what we call as skewness. So skewness is a description of the symmetric property of a distribution, and aside from being a description of symmetry, it is also we can actually compute for it, and we call the measurement of skewness as its skew. Okay. Now, while we will talk about later, I will present quantities. How do we determine based on measurement whether something is skewed or not skewed? We will not be doing the computations in this class, as this is an introductory topic or an introductory course to statistics. So that's something that you can look forward to in more advanced statistics subjects. Now let's take a look at the middle distribution. The middle density curve is what we call as a symmetric distribution. And I hope that that's quite obvious because when we divide the distribution right in the very middle, we see that the left side and the right side of the distribution are going to be reflections of each other. So whenever that happens, whenever we see the shape of the distribution, a density curve, and we identify the middlemost point or the line right in the very middle of the distribution, and if it just so happens that the left side and the right side of along this line are going to be reflections of each other, then we say that the distribution is symmetric. Now, this is of course not the same for the first and the third distribution, as we notice that they are not symmetric, and we will describe what we mean by it later. Now, one of the things that you also need to take note of is when we study density curves, we are also interested in what we call as tails of the distribution. So the tails of the distribution are the part of the density curve that from on which we see that the distribution tapers to. So this is where the curve becomes thinner. So if you notice a symmetric distribution, there are two tails. Since the distribution is symmetric, we should be able to see that the left tail and the right tail are also identical. So we identify two different tails of the distribution. All right. Now, in terms of measurement, we can actually compute for the variable or the coefficient of skewness. And based on when we try to interpret these values, the skew, if the skew is equal to 0 for a certain density curve or distribution, we say that the distribution is considered to be symmetric. The other two distributions that we see on the same slide are what we call as asymmetric distributions. But we need to specify because there are subtypes of asymmetric distribution. So let's take a look at the first one, the one that we see on the left. We notice that if we consider the two ends of the distribution, the left tail is more defined than the right tail, meaning it's thinner in that portion. Therefore, we identify it as the actual tail of the distribution. So even if we recognize that the distribution also sort of tapers to the other side because it is more defined on the left side, we say that the tail of the distribution is found on the left side. Whenever that happens, this kind of distribution is what we call as a left skewed distribution. So whenever we think about the direction of the skewness of the distribution, we always have to identify where the tail of the distribution is found. So because the tail is found on the left side, we say that the distribution is left skewed. What exactly does it mean if a distribution is left skewed? Remember that we're talking about density curves, and density curves represent distributions of a continuous random variable, right? So that means that if we try to represent this with a histogram, try to imagine bar graphs, bars, not bar graph. Try to imagine bars that compose this image over here. And we notice that the bars that are tall, the taller bars should be found on this region over here, which means that collectively, even if we divide the distribution in half, right in the very middle of the distribution, we see that much of the data is found on the right side of the middle part, and just a few of them will be found on the left side. So the scores are clustered. That's what we mean by it. The scores are actually clustered on the higher end of the distribution. Another way to call this kind of distribution, we also call it as a negatively skewed distribution. So if we consider this line over here to be 0, if we represent it with 0, we notice that the tail of the distribution is on the left end. Therefore, it is a negatively skewed distribution. Another reason why we call it negatively skewed is because the value or the skew of distributions such as this, when we try to compute for it, is going to be less than 0. So because it's a negative value, we say that the distribution is negatively skewed. All right, so let's take a look at the third one. In this case, obviously the tail is on the right end of the distribution, and that's why we call this as a right skew distribution. This happens when the scores are clustered on the lower end of the distribution instead of the higher end, as what we saw in left skew distributions. By value, the skew for these kinds of distribution is going to be greater than 0. That's why we also call it as a positively skewed distribution. Okay, so let's proceed. Another way of describing the shape of the distribution is by taking a look at what we call as the taking a look at what we call as kurtosis. So distributions such as the ones that we see over here can vary in terms of how much of the scores are found in the tails. When we try to distinguish between different distributions based on how much of the scores are found in the tails, we call this concept or this characteristic as kurtosis, which is a measurement to which the scores cluster in the tails of the distribution. So if we take a look at the tails of the distribution, notice, by the way, that all of these three distributions appear to be symmetric, right? They appear to be symmetric, but we are not interested in whether or not they are symmetric. What we are more interested in is how much of the scores, visually, how much of the scores can be found on its tail. So notice that if we use the yellow density curve as a point of comparison for the red and the blue one, we see that there is a much lesser um, number of scores that can be found in the tails of the red distribution when you compare it with the one in yellow. And when you take a look at the blue density curve, we notice that there are obviously much more scores that are clustered in both of the tails of the blue graph when you compare it to the yellow graph, and more obvious when we compare it to that in the red graph. So that's how kurtosis is seen in the shape of the distribution. But there's another way actually to analyze it, because the more scores that you find in details of the distribution, the lesser that you will find on its peak, right? So that's going to be the effect on the peak of the distribution. As you notice, if we have lesser scores, a lesser number of scores in the tails, the peak becomes flatter, right? So that's another way of trying to understand what we mean by kurtosis. And that's what I am going to use to explain later what we call these distributions. So when we try to compute for the coefficient of kurtosis, interpretations would be based on the value 3. So if the value for kurtosis is equal to 3, we say that the distribution is what we call as a mesokurtic distribution. This is where the tails contain the typical amount of scores, and it is neither too flat nor too peak. So anything that appears to be quite the typical for density curves is considered to be a mesokurtic distribution. On the other hand, if there's only quite a few scores in the tails, and the peak of the distribution seems to be flat, and I wanted to take note of that, flat, because that's going to help you remember the terms that we use to distinguish the different types of distributions based on kurtosis. If the peak is flat, we call the distribution to be flatly kurtic. And this happens when the kurtosis is less than 3. Of course, like I said, we will not be computing for these values, but I just want you to remember them. So when you go to more advanced statistics courses, you would be able to remember that we can actually base our interpretation, how we categorize distributions based on values that we can actually compute. So there is an objective way to determine whether a distribution is mesokurtic or platykurtic, or if it's the third one, which we call as leptokurtic. So whenever there are too many scores in the tails, or another way of looking at it is if the peak of the distribution is too sharp than the typical, then we say that the distribution is called leptokurtic. All right. Now, in the next slide, what we're going to do is I will present you with several examples of different shapes of distributions, different density curves. And what I would like you to do is determine the classification of the density curve based on both symmetry or skewness and based on kurtosis. But before we do that, before I flash the examples that we will be working with, I want you to take or to make a mental picture of the mesocritic distribution that we see over here, because this is going to be our basis for visually identifying the classification of the following examples. All right. So let's proceed with the next slide. Using your understanding of skewness and kurtosis, I want you to describe the following distributions based on shape alone. So this is going to be a subjective exercise, which means that for some of you, it may seem like symmetric or asymmetric. Others would look at a shape as mesokurtic instead of the other two. But that's totally based on how we look at it. So, like I said, it's very important that we try to remember the figures that we saw in the previous slide. This is the first one that I would like you to work with. So determine what kind of distribution are we looking at. All right. So in terms of, you need to think about it both in terms of symmetry and in terms of kurtosis. So both in terms of skewness and kurtosis. Okay. You may pause the video at this point if you need more time, but I will provide you with a correct answer in a few seconds. Okay. So if you were thinking that this distribution is symmetric, you are correct. If you can draw a line along the middle of the distribution, you would notice that the left side and the right side are going to be reflections of each other. Therefore, it is easily symmetric based on the visual. Now, in terms of kurtosis, you notice that the distribution seems to be flat on the peak, right? So that should give you an idea that this is a symmetric platykurtic distribution. Okay, so it's a symmetric platykurtic distribution. All right, let me show you the second one, and then I want you to pause the video so that you can take some time to think about what kind of distribution we are looking at. All right, so what we're seeing now, if you notice, the distribution obviously is not symmetric. So that's easy to determine. So imagine a line in the very middle of the distribution along the x-axis. The left side is not going to be symmetric to the right side. So it's asymmetric. But you also need to identify which asymmetric distribution it is. It can be left skewed or right skewed. And in this case, because the tail is on the right, we say that this is a right skewed or a positive distribution. Now, in terms of kurtosis, you should be able to see that it's not very different from a mesokurtic distribution, because the amount of scores or the quantity of scores that we see on the tails is not very different from the typical distribution, the typical mesokurtic distribution that we show. So this is a positively skewed mesokurtic distribution. Now, if you identify this as a leptokurtic distribution, I totally understand why you would say that, because it does seem like the peak is a little too sharp. So that raises the importance of not depending on the visual density curves lang. We always need to try. Eventually, we should be able to learn how to compute for the coefficients of skewness and kurtosis, so that we can make an objective decision of whether or not a distribution is whatever category we feel like it is. All right, but let's continue with the third one, and you can pause the video again here. All right. So this distribution is obviously asymmetric again, but in this case, the tail is found on the left end. So that should tell us that the distribution is a left skewed distribution. If this is the middle part of the x-axis, when we draw a vertical line here, notice that the left side is not going to be the reflection of the right side. So it's easily a negatively skewed distribution. And notice, we know that this is a mesokurtic distribution, right? It's a mesokurtic distribution. So take a look at the amount of scores that we see on the tail. So if this is Meso-Curtis, obviously there are more values in the tail, and the peak of the distribution is um, more defined as a sharp. Therefore, this is a leptokurtic distribution. So it's a negatively skewed leptokurtic distribution. Let's try the last one. Okay, so the last density curve that we see over here is a little different from the other ones that we already talked about, because it has a certain characteristic that is different from the ones that we have identified. So let's talk more about it. Notice that when we try to divide the distribution into two parts, right at the very middle, the left side and the right side are going to be mirror images of each other. And because of that, this is considered to be a symmetric distribution. It's a symmetric distribution. Aside from that, we can also say that the distribution is mesocurtic. I'm not sure if that's pretty obvious, but you should be able to see that when we try to compare it with this density curve over here, it does appear like the amount or the quantity of scores in the tails are very similar to what we see on a mesocurtic distribution. But what's so interesting about this density curve is that aside from being symmetric and mesocurtic, it actually has two peaks, something that we haven't seen in the other density curves yet. And whenever that happens, we have to remember that density curves are based on histograms. And whenever a histogram would have two bars, imagine there are two bars here of the same height, and it so happens that these two bars are the tallest in all of the bars in the histogram. That means that there are two values in the distribution along the x-axis. There are two values that have the same frequencies, and that is the greatest frequency. And this should already remind you that whenever we talk about the highest frequency or the greatest frequency, we're actually talking about the mode. And in this case, because there are two peaks, there should be two modes in the distribution. And we call this kind of distribution as bimodal. All right, so it's a bimodal distribution. Okay, in this next part of the topic, we shall talk about the normal distribution or the Gaussian distribution for bell curves. But I will be stopping the video here so that you can take some time to rest and think about all of the things that are covered in the previous video. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to send me a message via Discord so we can talk about any concerns that you may have, and I can help you try to understand whatever it is that you need my help with. I'll see you in the next video. Bye, kids.